Hello, Garland Nixon here, and we are hanging out with the one and only Mark Sleboda in Moscow. Let's talk. Hello, Garland Nixon, hanging out with the one and only Mark Sleboda, our professional cynic, a man from which we learn the ropes of cynicism, the intricacies, the fine intricacies of professional cynicism. Mark, welcome back.
Garland, thanks for having me. It's always an honor and a pleasure to be on the show. And other dogs bite only their enemies, but I bite also my friends in order to save them. Diogenes of Sinope.
Oh, I love that one. I love that. All right, here we go. Let's start off with the fairly obvious, the Trump-Putin phone call. And of course, as a result, there is a much weeping and gnashing of teeth in the EU as the last thing I saw in Russian media pertinent to that particular conversation was that Trump doesn't want to use the word unconditional anymore. No, not unconditional, which certainly implies that he's not down with, if you don't do this, if the Russians don't do exactly what we want, we're going to sanction them. It seems like that coalition of the willing and their plan to drag Trump into this forever sanctions dance and all that stuff is crumbling. Mark, your thoughts on this whole thing going on here?
Yeah, I mean, do you know how many days are left in Trump's presidency?
Almost all of them.
Yeah, because, oh my God, am I sick of talking about this guy? Oh my God. I mean, how much longer? Oh, too long. All right. So, half the news of every week now seems to be Trump's social media posts and who he talked to with whom and who threw money at him and all.
Who gave him a plane? How about that?
Yeah. So anyway, so Trump and Putin at Trump's I don't want to say insistence, but shall we say insistent demand, had a telephone call that evidently lasted more than 2 hours. They did talk Ukraine and they did talk a bit more than Ukraine, but it would seem that Donald Trump didn't want to put the phone down. I mean, he just wanted to keep talking. I can't think of too many people that I would enjoy talking to on the phone for 2 hours, much less through a interpreter. But anyway. So this is the EU leaders and of course Zelensky in Kiev are in a fit of frustration and desperation. So they have been, you're right, they've been trying to maneuver Trump into basically a return to the Biden foreign policy, right? The war continues. The U.S. returns to the game of sanctions and large military aid packages. And it has to be said that for the most part, Trump appears to be dragging his feet on this, right? He's not proving he's wavered, right? He's moving one way and then a step closer to Zelensky, a step closer to Putin. I don't think that there is a coherent plan in the White House about what they're doing. No, I'm serious. I don't think they had a plan, right? This was Kellogg's plan. It was sold to Trump before he evidently even became president. And, Putin said no. I mean, we've been talking about it for months. We've been talking about it since he was elected. But, part of that, kind of like the most insistent demand, was a 30-day unconditional ceasefire, which Russia was like, no. We've been saying this for over a year now. For a year, practically a year. no ceasefire, certainly no unconditional ceasefires. This is our long list of conditions for enacting a ceasefire, which includes all of the West, not just the US, but all of the West, stop military and intelligence aid to the Kiev regime during the course of that ceasefire. And the Kiev regime has to withdraw all of their troops from Donetsk, Lugansk, Kherson, and Zaporozhye, that they still have troops. And now was added to that list of demands. Also, you have to, the Kiev regime has to withdraw troops from the buffer zone that Putin has ordered created in Sumy and Kharkov regions, right? Because the Kiev regime attempted incursions there, right? You know, the curse incursion lasted for months. And now Putin has declared that in order to protect Russia's borders, that buffer zones must be created in the Kharkov and Sumy regions, oblasts of Ukraine. So that was added to the list. You know, obviously Russia's been down this road of ceasefires before. Minsk 1, Minsk 2. Then there was Trump's attempted energy infrastructure ceasefire, and then Putin's unilaterally declared Easter and Victory Day ceasefires, and the Kiev regime has violated them all. Right, every one of them. The Minsk ones were used to pump the Kiev regime full of arms for years, which, you know, the Kremlin, as Putin himself says, naively went along with it, believing in the Europeans. And we've heard from no less than Merkel and Holland and
Poroshenko.
Poroshenko, the Kiev regime's candy oligarch leader, that they never had any intention of fulfilling the Minsk Accords, that it was just buying time, stringing Russia along while they, built up a powerful, what they imagined was a powerful NATO armed and trained military force in Ukraine for the Kiev regime. So all of this, there's all this expectation. I can't believe the number of Western major publications that printed articles for the last couple of months saying that Putin was going to accept the ceasefire, when the Russians have been saying incessantly, right? Not just Putin, but Lavrov and Peskov. I mean, you name it. Everyone has said there will be no ceasefire, at least not without this extreme list of conditions, which we know you'll never meet anyway. So no ceasefire. And they still went to the ceasefire demand, expecting that Russia would, I don't know, back down or agree to it for some reason. And Trump, over the last 24 hours, the Wall Street Journal reports, after his phone call with Putin, reported to European leaders, because Trump called Zelensky and the European leaders before his phone call with Putin, and after his phone call with Putin, he called them all back because, I guess we needed a Team West huddle, both before and after the phone call, which seems kind of, I don't know, seems kind of extensive to me. But he said, well, Putin doesn't agree to a ceasefire because he thinks he's winning. Duh. I mean, how many times does this, need to be stressed? I know it has punctuated the Western mainstream media narrative on Ukraine, right? At times, Russia has been essentially on the offensive for, since the Kiev regime's failed 2023 offensive, for the most part, right? Sometimes it's a grinding offensive, sometimes it's more intensive in certain areas, but I mean, it's been going on. And even the Western mainstream media, however grudgingly, has admitted that Russia is outproducing all of NATO and NATO's major allies and the Kiev regime, of course, together in terms of artillery shell production, air defense interceptor missiles, all of these essential armaments and equipment needed for this conflict. The Secretary General of NATO, now Mark Rutte, Tutti Frutti, has himself said that Russia is outproducing all of NATO 4 to 5 times, right? So, I mean, it's not in denial. So, winning on the battlefield and winning the war of military industrial production in a war of attrition, right? I mean, so yes, Russia is winning, right? Why would they agree to a ceasefire that would be used to pump the Kiev regime, allow them to forcibly conscript and maybe even give some of their conscripts some training and pump them full of more weapons, such as you could find them, although that's getting very hard at this point. So Russia said no. And then there was this for last Monday, not this previous Monday, but even a Monday before that, the Europeans had been insisting on a countdown. If Putin doesn't agree to an unconditional ceasefire, then we're going to lay the sanctions hammer on them again, because the first 28,096 sanctions weren't enough, right? The next one will be the straw that breaks the camel's back, of course, right? So, but they believed that they had the Trump administration on board for this. And then first, Putin threw them for a loop with these direct talks in Istanbul. And so that whole sanctions in return for no ceasefire ultimatum that got put on pause. And now after the Trump Putin phone call, and still Russia won't agree to a ceasefire, the Europeans are like, well, then we'll enact our own sanctions. And so they've declared the 17th round of sanctions, I believe, which at this point is mainly sanctions on other countries like India and China, in an attempt to punish them for continuing to do trade with Russia, particularly in energy. And both China and India have said nothing that the US or the EU can do is going to make us stop buying Russian energy. In fact, India vastly increased again their amount of oil purchases that Russia is exporting them to in the past week. So there's floundering going on. The Europeans are really frustrated. They're not getting what they wanted from Trump, which was when Putin says no, punish him, right? So, and believing that would drag Trump completely back into a Brandon 2.0 foreign policy, which he's been making steps towards and then kind of hedging back, which is why I believe that they really don't. One day he's listening to Kellogg, and the other day Witkoff is telling him something else, and then he's talking to Putin. And after the most recent phone call with Putin, he started insisting that the talk of a ceasefire, right, stop using the adjective unconditional. He says, I don't like that, right? So all of a sudden, after Putin's phone call, and the Europeans are having to go along with it, right? Because, well, that's the game. Everyone's got to, butter up the God Emperor. So no one can challenge him or anything. Everything has got to be this game of subtle ego flattery and playing to his narcissism and manipulation. But no one is going to outright defy him or challenge him, even when they're trying to do this. So once again, there's no clear path for Trump to either escalate or de-escalate. He's dancing about. The U.S. has at this point threatened to walk away from the conflict multiple times and never has. They keep getting pulled back in. And we know Lindsey Graham is screaming now. He's got 80 senators backing his bone-crushing sanctions bill against India, evidently for buying Russian oil in the U.S. Senate. But everything is on pause because they're not getting the go signal that they want. In fact, they're getting this footsie dance from Trump on Putin, and they're extremely frustrated about it. And meanwhile, it's become clear that Russia is preparing. Russia is applying offensive pressure that is having serious effect all along the conflict line right now. In the middle of May, for the last week, Russia is averaging 31 square kilometers a day. That's the territory that they're taking. Now, this is not a game of territorial acquisition or maneuver warfare, even at this point, right? This is just still the war of attrition, but the war of attrition is moving that much faster. People just don't notice it because the contact line and Ukraine itself is so big. But 31 square kilometers a day, was once Kiev regime controlled parts of Ukraine and most likely will not be again. That's pretty significant, right? A lot of people are expecting, Hollywood style, the game, the war over Russian tanks entering Kiev in 1 or 2 days, and they really don't understand the nature of modern peer near peer conflict. But Russia is set, and this has been admitted by the Kiev regime sources, Western sources, Wall Street Journal, others, that Russia is going to launch one, possibly two major, much larger offensives in specific directions over the course of the summer, probably within the next few weeks. And there's some 2 entire armies, reserve armies, the Wall Street Journal has reported, 240,000 troops, kitted out with the very best equipment. In fact, better than a lot of what is being used on the contact line, like T-90Ms, Proryvs, the Russian most modern, regularly produced main battle tank, right? A brand new off the Russia's making now something like 300 of them a year. And this is on top of, older ones it's refurbishing and a few other models as well. It's very significant. They're going to let loose. Now, we don't know exactly where they're going to be used yet. There's a number of locations, and probably Russia doesn't know where they're going to be used yet, because that is the nature of this combat, right? Everything has to remain fluid, right? Because of the power of 24/7 satellite and drone reconnaissance, right? Strategic surprise is extremely difficult. And the way to get around that is with having troops that are fluid, able to identify weaknesses, right? And then move quickly where those weaknesses are identified. And you have to have it helps certainly to have a larger amount of troops. And we now know that Russia has some 640,000 plus troops just for the SMO in the theater. And now at least some 240,000 more, volunteer contract soldiers specifically for the SMO being kept in reserve. So they've got the manpower, right? The math has been done by Western media, right? They admit that Russia is enlisting somewhere between 30 and Putin has suggested up to 60,000 new volunteer contract soldiers every month, 30,000 every month, right? Which means that Russia's, when you do the casualties and the math and some people's contracts possibly expiring and permanent injuries and then temporary injuries, the Russian military is probably growing somewhere between 20 and 25,000 troops every month.
Wow.
Just for the SMO, right? Meanwhile, the Kiev regimes can't even come close to forcibly conscripting low quality. We don't want to fight. We're being dragged off the streets like dogs without any training and thrown in to defend trenches at this point. So the Kiev regime's quality, not only their quantity continually is going down. They can't make up for their losses, but their quality is going down as well.
I don't know, Mark. That's what we're seeing in Britain. The Russian economy is on the brink as Putin is quickly running out of tanks.
What the hell tabloid is this?
The Express, of course.
Oh, well, that is a tabloid. That is a tabloid.
Experts believe Moscow stock, the tanks, artillery, and the infantry fighting vehicles will be running out. And look, it's I mean, come on, Mark.
Who is Richard Ashmore? Never even heard of him. Anyway, senior news report. Does from the Express, does this fit in somewhere in between reports on the Loch Ness Monster and big-breasted girls on page 3? I mean,
Russian leader Vladimir Putin could be forced into peace by a dwindling supply of equipment.
This is the same nonsense we've been hearing since the beginning of the war. More reputable outlets have dropped this kind of thing, right? So we're running out of missiles, running out of tanks, looting washing machines for semiconductor chips, shovels, everything. And still somehow Russia is outproducing NATO by 4 to 5 times, according to the Secretary General of fucking NATO. Right.
Well, however, Europe's outproducing you in bull crap. So, I mean, that's...
We do have that.
Exactly. And, I will say one thing, Mark,
and
about...
cocaine on a train.
Yeah, this is important, I think, thing to say. I remember before Trump won, went to this event in New York, and Dmitry Polyansky was there. And I heard Lavrov say this when the Biden people were in, and it came out that Biden had given... a command that nobody in his administration, well, somebody did. We're told it was Biden. Somebody gave it. I don't know what the hell Biden, if he even knew what was going on. But here's the point, that nobody was allowed to talk to the Russians, right? With Witkoff going there, with Trump going there, Polyansky and Lavrov and these people talked about the importance of, no matter what, these two, having a discussion. What we're seeing is, we make fun of it and we laugh at all the foolishness, right? But it is critical that a discussion, that the two powers talk. And now we see why Joe Biden didn't want that. Now we see why the Europeans are, the EU coalition of the crazies are like, no, you can't talk to the Russians. Why? Because as Trump talks to the Russians, as no matter, he may deal with the neocons at home. I'm not saying Trump is perfect, but a discussion allows reality to creep into the process. It allows somebody, Donald Trump, they may have 80 people ready to vote in the Senate, but they need 81. And that first one, that 81 is Donald Trump. And the fact that he actually talked to Vladimir Putin means that all the stuff he's hearing, Vladimir Putin said, let me tell you how I feel. And he could choose to believe it or not, but he got it right from the horse's mouth. So I come out of there in all seriousness saying, it is critical, no matter what country, no matter how angry you are, no matter what happens between two countries. What we see is the importance of diplomacy and the importance of a conversation. And then the stuff that was said, of course, Trump's going to come out and blabber all over the place. He's going to come out and put Truth Social posts, and people get to read it and talk about it. So we see the importance of diplomacy and of a diplomatic discussion and how that does change the dynamics here. Mark.
Yeah. Okay. So you're absolutely right. The importance of dialogue and diplomacy between two of the 3 generally recognized current great powers on the earth, right? The US and Russia have not been talking at all for 3 years, right? Now they're talking again. And whatever else, we can always say that the US under Trump has stopped, for at least the moment, directly firing ballistic missiles into mainland Russia, thus averting the quickest path to World War III, right? I mean, that right there. And they're talking again, whereas they weren't before. So the Biden administration, or the Blinken and Sullivan administration, refused to do diplomacy, right? I mean, I called him Blinken, the Secretary of War, for years, right? But the New York Times even admitted it themselves in an article right after he was out of office, of course. But they refused to do diplomacy because they didn't think they had to. They thought diplomacy, they full believers in the messianic supremacist idea of U.S./Western exceptionalism, right? For the Europeans, American exceptionalism. They believe that they are societally, structurally, morally superior to everyone else, and they don't need. In fact, it is wrong to talk to adversaries, right? It is a sin. It's not necessary. In fact, it would be wrong to make concessions because black white hat, Manichaean fairy tale, all of this thing ties into that ideology. So they just refused. They didn't think they had to do diplomacy. Now we got the Trump administration, which at least Trump, right, and his personal envoy Witkoff, whom seems to be Secretary of State number 2.
Number 1, some may argue.
Oh yeah, you absolutely. I stand corrected. Marco Rubio's number 2. I take it back. Anyway, at least he trusts no experience, no training, no formal education, but he does speak fluent Russian, evidently. So there is that. But the Trump administration is quite obviously not good at diplomacy, right? For one thing, they've got a divided administration, right? I mean, where you've got 2 entirely different paths forward on Russia laid out by different factions within the administration. And maybe Trump likes it that way. Maybe he likes being the decider and presented, but it creates this kind of Kellogg and is saying one thing, and Trump is saying entirely a different thing. A half a day later on his, megaphone screaming capitals letter on Truth Social. So it creates a very disjointed attempt at diplomacy, right? You're absolutely right. Give them credit. They're doing diplomacy where the previous administration did it, but they're very bad at it.
Right.
And it has to be said also that I don't believe they would be doing diplomacy if Russia wasn't winning.
Clearly. Yeah.
If Russia was losing, right, it would be dictating, well, they're still trying to dictate terms, but not quite as obsequiously as they would be otherwise. So yes, and Russia is all for the dialogue continuing. And again, they actually envision 2 tracks of diplomacy, right, that only slightly overlap. One, improved bilateral relations just between the U.S. and Russia, restoring basic diplomatic functions between the 2 of them, which is still ongoing in process, by the way. They've only made little tiny baby steps in that direction, actually, so far. And
we have an ambassador now.
Yeah, we do have that. That's. Again,
I got a picture with him the other week, so I know.
Congratulations on that score. That is a feather in the cap that you're not wearing, but you can stick it underneath the earphone there somewhere. But that and then of course the Ukraine possibly peace process, which I'm going to tell you is everyone knows is not going to go anywhere. Trump still can't agree to those terms. No U.S. president can. The terms Russia is demanding, and Russia is not going to let the U.S., no matter how chummy Trump is trying to be, dictate terms on this existential conflict with them, where Russia is attritting the entirety of NATO, essentially, and not won, but is certainly winning and is on that path. And to that regard, Medvedev, right, the former president and prime minister, Dmitry Medvedev, I liked. He was once in a seemingly another world, another time. Medvedev was this neoliberal darling of the West at a time in the early 2000s when Russia was still flirting with improving relations with the U.S. under George W. Bush, and Putin was bringing up again Russia joining NATO. and neoliberal Medvedev was temporarily put in as president for 4 years, in this kind of queening situation, the chess reference. I remember a video of Medvedev at some function dancing to what was in the late 90s or mid 90s, sometime in the 90s, a song. I don't even know who sings it. American Boy.
Oh, geez.
American Boy. Yes. And Medvedev is like a moron shuffling around dancing to this song. And right, the Russian patriots and nationalists at the time were gnashing their teeth and blah, blah, blah. But Medvedev has since apparently undergone some type of Damascene conversion and become a war hawk, certainly, even you could even call him a fire-breathing nationalist. I like to think of him, since Zhirinovsky, the blowhard Russian nationalist, beloved by many in Russia, at least for his amusement value. He passed away a couple of years ago, and his statements are still being brought out as prophecy. Zhirinovsky said this would happen then, right? Anyway, and he was, he called some good ones, actually. But I think that Medvedev has either become or been rebranded as the Zhirinovsky 2.0, because Russia needed a Zhirinovsky. But regardless, Medvedev has continually, over the course of this conflict, been the bad cop within the Kremlin, right? And to Putin's good cop when it comes to diplomatic statements. But it doesn't mean that what he says should not be regarded as coming from the Kremlin, from the Russian National Security Council, the new Politburo.
Say alter ego could be another way to look at it.
Yeah,
Putin's alter ego. That's the way I've always said. Putin's like, I can't see what he said.
So Medvedev said this week at a legal forum in St. Petersburg that this is the Kiev regime's, this is Ukraine's last chance. That there won't be another chance after this, particularly, I imagine, after Russia launches these big offensives this summer. That
implies some kind of an offensive or something, doesn't it?
It does, but it also, signaling, all right, Trump has bent your arm behind your back and forced you to actually engage in diplomacy with us, right? Direct negotiations, which Zelensky had said would never happen, right? He actually has a diktat in force that no Ukrainian officials are allowed to conduct diplomacy with Russia while Putin is still president. Well, obviously it hasn't been rescinded. It's now just being ignored. And at Trump's screaming capital letter insistence on social media, yes, the Kiev regime was forced to create a diplomatic team. They were sent to Istanbul, and supposedly it's not set in stone yet, but there is supposed to be a next round sometime in the future in the Vatican.
Did that come from the Putin-Trump conversation or something? No.
Yeah. So that, I think that's not from the Trump-Putin conversation, but behind the scenes of that, right? The same time frame. So it may have been discussed during that. There's no definitive word on that from the Russian side yet. The Vatican, with the new Pope, I guess, the new American Pope, is evidently hot on hosting the next round of these negotiations. But there's nothing set in stone yet that I've heard. But this has been forced, right? There are Ukrainians, right? They're not agreeing on anything. They agreed on a prisoner transfer, which was probably in the works anyway. And my understanding, by the way, is that there are numerous reports that in order to reach the 1,000 for 1,000, right, that this is supposed to be the largest POW transfer so far, because Russia has so many more, somewhere between 5 and 10 times more POWs as the Kiev regime has Russian soldiers, that they are padding this out with their own citizens who have been arrested for political crimes, right?
Speaking Russian, things like
yeah,
that, going to church and worshiping as a Russian.
Working in a Russian church, wearing St. George ribbon, that sort of thing. They're trying to their own citizens, which is just insane. But they have actually done that before. If you remember, the leader of the largest opposition party in Ukraine, at one point threatening to become larger than Zelensky's own Servant of the People party, right? The opposition bloc, Medvedchuk, he was arrested for treason, for not completely backing Zelensky and not approving of the conflict. And he was traded as part of a prisoner of war, the leader of the largest Ukrainian opposition party. Yes, he has connections and ties with Putin, but it has to be said that East Ukraine generally has ties and connections with Russia, family level, language, everything. So it's not really a surprise. But that's how they padded it out. Nothing else was agreed other than they're going to present each other's list of conditions for a ceasefire, which means Russians' conditions, because supposedly the Kiev regime agreed to unconditional ceasefire. I don't know, but I mean, obviously that's not going to go anywhere because the Kiev regime is never going to accept Russians. But at least they were in a room together, which is that hasn't happened since 2022, right? Since the Kiev regime walked away from Istanbul. In fact, there's a reason Russia asked for these talks in Istanbul, apparently in the same palace and room where the Istanbul talks in 2022 the Kiev regime walked away from. And the leader of their negotiating team, Medinsky, is the same leader of the negotiating team back then. So Russia is not just signaling, they're openly saying that there is continuance and that the ground level beginning is Istanbul, right? What was tentatively, supposedly agreed on by Istanbul. I don't believe the Kiev regime was ever serious about that. I don't. They were doing it simply to buy time, right? Budanov has admitted that in an interview with Radio Free Europe and Radio Liberty. Yes, Boris Johnson came bringing the word that the Western weapons supplies are solidified, but I don't believe that the Kiev regime was ever going to agree to it anyway. It wasn't, if you find it convenient for your political narrative to say, oh, it's all Boris Johnson's fault. Boris Johnson was just the bag man for what was already pull the diplomatic cover over Russia's eyes again. But that's why Russia has signaled that is the continuance. That is the ground floor level of negotiations, and we have a lot of demands since then. But I don't believe that track is going to go anywhere. And again, Trump seems to keep deflecting and dancing. And now he's talking about a ceasefire in talks, but not an unconditional ceasefire. So one step forward, in the Russian direction with that regard. But, there's only so much deflection that can go on there.
Well, let me throw this at you though, Mark. Yeah, I think one of the things, and I think Trump kind of gets this in a way, and I'm not here, people get so mad if you talk about Trump and you say anything other than he's a madman, if you just try to talk about him in the context of international geopolitics. The reality is this: as times get more difficult for the Kiev regime, they may be more motivated to do other things, maybe or maybe not. But I think maybe Trump sees that as time as his only ally, that okay, I'll get them to talk. They'll continue to talk. The Russians will get pressure on them. Things will get worse for them and their supporters in Europe. And either they'll fight to the end and get crushed, or as things start looking worse and worse, maybe some people in the coalition will say, oh, things are going real bad. Perhaps we need to try to figure a way out of this because this thing's going to crumble. But the only, to me, option for Trump, based on who he's dealing with and what he's dealing with, is to give it some time and see if something breaks in a way that gives him the distance that he needs to make a decision. Now, do I really think the Kiev regime will do anything other than fight to the end? No. But if I'm Trump, I think time is, I need some time. I got to kill time. I can't make a decision anyway. So I got to kill some time.
That may be where we hope Trump is moving to, right? But up until now, he's actually been insisting now, immediately, yesterday, right?
Yeah.
Everything, talks yesterday, meet Putin, everything had to be yesterday. I would say that in the U.S. interest of saving a U.S. proxy regime in Ukraine, which is ultimately what Trump is trying to do. And he said that outright, right?
Oh, of course, yeah.
I'm trying to save Ukraine. By that, he means the Kiev regime. You people should get in line. I'm trying to save you, trying to save your state. And Medvedev is saying this is the last chance, right? And what he's talking about is Ukrainian statehood, a independent Ukrainian state, right? And he said specifically, if something is not agreed to soon, and Putin had suggested as much a month or two before, then next time we'll be talking unconditional ceasefire, right? Yeah. I mean, I'm sorry, unconditional surrender.
Yeah,
right.
Ain't gonna be no negotiations. Ain't going to be down for no negotiations in Istanbul after this.
Russia will dictate the terms, right? And that is not good for the U.S. goal of preserving a regime in Kiev. So I would argue that from another perspective, you could actually say the time is against the Trump administration.
Yeah. Well, how about this, Mark? How about this? And this is not possible. I think Trump may want to get out without taking a giant L.
Sure.
You know what I mean? What do you think about that? That maybe that's his biggest goal. That not to say, I got the big L and it's on my, sure. Everybody's going to say, Trump, you lost. And he's trying to find a way out without the big L. But I don't think that's possible.
He doesn't like Zelensky. He doesn't like the European leaders. He has contempt for them. He doesn't much care about Ukraine, but he's still the American president. And he doesn't want to be seen and depicted as the president who surrendered, who betrayed Ukraine to Putin, right? That is because that will become the dominant narrative of his second presidency, and he doesn't want that. So he's in a bad situation, right? He doesn't much care, but at the moment he's playing the game that he feels he has to, and he's tacking with the wind as events go and as arguments are presented to him.
But sometimes there are times when all you can do is buy time and hope for a break. You know what I mean? There's times when that's all you can do is buy a little time and hope for something to break.
The European plan right now, they're trying to stretch this out for another 4 years.
Yeah, exactly.
Hoping that some black swan, something changes. The next U.S. president is Lindsey Graham or the equivalent in a Democrat or something. That everyone is playing the game of time to some regard. Russia's very patient right now, right? They're winning on the battlefield. They're winning in the war of attrition of military production. They're not in an undue hurry, right? That doesn't mean they want to stretch this out forever, but Russia's on their own internal time frame.
Politically speaking, politically speaking, think about this. They're watching the internal political problems of Europe.
Sure.
Europe is fighting a wave of, for lack of a better term, I hate this, populism, but they're fighting a wave of Euroscepticism. They're there's a political wave. Look what just happened in the UK and Romania. They had to fight it off. Poland, I don't know what's going to happen there with their elections, but there is a strain of politics in Europe that's not happy with what's going on, which again, I'm not saying it's the best, but but Europe is the so-called centrist neocons are struggling with that.
let's be a little bit more explicit than that, even, right? Because sometimes it's on the alt or far right. Sometimes with Fico in Slovakia, it's actually the far left, right? I'll call them right out, freedom fighters, right?
Yes,
It
yes, yes.
is a rejection of the Brussels technocracy, right? And the European political elite, right, trying to turn the EU into some kind of dystopian European states of America on their terms, where the power isn't in each individual country, right, but the power is in Brussels, right, or in the European Commission, right, if you want to call it that. That is a rejection that is occurring. In some places, it's been incredibly successful. Slovakia and Hungary.
What do you think about do you have to think about the Poland elections? I did want to ask you about that, about what's happening in Poland. You familiar with that?
Yeah, Poland, unfortunately, Poland is still in the Polish equivalent of the center right, center left shuffle. Anyone with an outside opinion is still too far down in the polls to matter at this point. In France and Germany, we still see what we see is the emergence of this anti-Brussels technocrat, European skeptic, EU skeptic politics to dominance, right? Le Pen's a national rally party, right? Having the largest share going in of popular opinion going into the last election, and the AfD in Germany, the Alternative for Germany, now by most polling the most popular party in Germany. But structurally, right, because there's more than just two parties in these countries, there is still a coalition of all the other political forces of the establishment center, the center right, center left, to still cling desperately on to power in those places. And they're trying, and Romania is another place in that situation, where they're trying all they can to, politically exclude these opinions, right, outside of the Brussels technocratic consensus, the center right, center left hegemonic triangulation of politics, right? In legal charges against Le Pen, considering banning the AfD in Germany, keeps being brought up again and again, accused as extremist by recognized as extremist by German intelligence, right? Allowing all kinds of maneuvers against them. In Romania, just banning candidates for spurious regions, left and right, until you're left with a round 3 draft pick who can't win the election, right? However it's held on the anti-Brussels side. So in some places, it hasn't been successful yet, but it's still a rising tide, right? In not everywhere in Europe, it must be said, but in multiple places.
Yeah. So again, that's what we're talking about. Time is on the side of those who want a better resolution, because the forces who are the most hawkish, shall we say, they're struggling to hold on to power. Politically, they're weakening. So time is certainly not on their side. I did want to ask you about this. On the battlefield, Briansk.
Yeah.
Apparently the Ukrainians are up to mischief in that area again.
Yeah. So if you'll remember, we actually talked about Briansk back in this November, December, and I put together a couple regions where the Kiev regime, with Kursk failing, that they might try another offensive, right? And the Briansk region was Zaporozhye nuclear power plant was one of those, and another one that I kept bringing up was Briansk. Mm-hmm. Briansk is in the northern part of the Russian-Ukrainian border, just to the west of the Kursk region.
Okay.
Right?
Yep.
So up there, right? Again, it's a sparsely populated area.
And where does it border? What's the closest town, say, and what's the closest areas that people might have heard of that it borders in Ukraine?
So it's the Chernigov and Sumy region.
Okay, Sumy. Okay, gotcha. Yep.
Right. Also, again, not extremely populated, not strategic. But if you go through either Chernigov or Sumy, then you go down to Kiev. Right.
Gotcha.
That's where Russia came in 2022. So finally, it appears that the Kiev regime has tried or is trying to launch something in Briansk. Right now, it appears to be small scale. Right. The only thing that is confirmed on the Russian side is a deep penetrating DRG group of about 70 to 100 people. But there may be much more than this. So again, this is like the Kursk region of Russia, sparsely populated, extremely heavily forested area. In fact, there's one giant forest belt that runs from the Ukrainian border, right, all the way up, kind of curving into the middle, and then to the northwest, right up into the outskirts of Briansk itself. And evidently this DRG group, this Kiev regime DRG group, was attempting to sneak through the forest and amass a critical forces of troops for some type of, ridiculous play at another incursion into Russia for headlines and narrative value and everything. Oh, look at sneak attack on all the way into Briansk, right? That's quite a distance. But the Kiev regime has effectively used forest belts from the beginning of this conflict, right? Because it's easier for them, particularly in the summer months with all the foliage, to hide from Russian long-range strikes, artillery, easier to hide from drones. They've used force to their advantage. Russia's occasionally use them to their advantage too, but considering that the Kiev regime is on the defensive, for most of this with less power, they've focused on that. And this was an attempt to sneak through a big forest belt, and it may be ongoing. Russia's now trying to cordon a very large area of forest off. I mean, this is like, I don't know, Mirkwood or something, if you're a fan of The Hobbit, Lord of the Rings. It's a big forest belt. It goes right up into the outskirts of Briansk. So
I'm looking at it now. You can see it from the Ukrainian border, this gigantic forest line, and then it gets a little skinny, but it's giant, and Briansk is sitting next to this gigantic forest that just continues past it.
So they're trying to sneak up through the forest.
Okay.
And they were caught before reaching Briansk, but there may be more of them. We don't know at this point how many they've managed to amass thus far in this forest, and where they may have been headquartering out of in the kind of northwestern Sumy region. There was a training ground that they may have been trying to amass people on. Russia hit that with Iskanders this week, and supposedly there was a number of Western NATO troops there that were training them up for this mission. They claim low casualties, but the Russian side says very high casualties on that event. And from what I've seen of it, the pictures, it looks like it was probably a high casualty event. So Russia's taking action. We'll see. Regardless, this is another suicide game pursuing narratives and headlines, just like the whole Kursk Fool's Crusade was. Just right now, at least, it seems to be on a much smaller scale. The leader of the 47th Mechanized Brigade of the Kiev regime, the commander, the 47th is, if you've been paying attention, is what is often referred to as the Kiev regime's fire brigade. These guys were largely NATO equipped and trained, and they're the ones that are continually thrown in when other brigades fail, right? This is probably their most frequently used, not maybe an ideological brigade necessarily like the Azov brigades, but significant. So the commander of the 47th, supposedly, from what he says on social media, he is resigning or trying to resign because of being given stupid suicidal orders like he was continually given in Kursk, right? To die chasing nothing of any strategic value, headlines and narratives. And that's this Briansk crawling through the the forest with DRG groups. It's that written all over again. It just seems to be on a smaller scale right now.
Lastly, before we go, lastly, I got one last question, and that's about drones in Moscow. But before we go there, and there you go. That's Alexandria. Is that Darkiv? I guess that's his name, Darkiv. He's the new Russian ambassador to the U.S., and you see me there with my ribbon. Now, I tried to become the assistant ambassador, but there were a few small problems that we couldn't get over. Number one, I'm not Russian. Number two, I don't speak Russian. But I'm hoping that maybe in the future we'll be able to iron out those, few little problems, and I'll be able to represent the great country of Russia. But as for right now, Mark, it ain't working out.
At least on radio and social media.
There we go. All right. Now, last thing, the drone wars, the attack of the drone clones. And I understand they're still on a regular basis heaving drones at Moscow.
Okay. So the drone war on both sides continues, right? I mean, drones are a huge part of this conflict. If it was primarily an artillery war at the beginning, it's assisted by drones. It's now a drone war with artillery playing particularly for the Russian side, but now a slightly lesser role in the background, although still important for Russia. The Kiev regime simply doesn't have artillery and artillery shells anymore because NATO can't provide them, which is one of the reasons they're trying to focus on drones instead. But FPV drones, reconnaissance drones, long-range strike drones. The Kiev regime has been trying to do long-range strike drones. Just before Victory Day, there was this 500 drone strikes all across, deep in different areas of Russia, including towards Moscow. So some heavy strikes. In 1 week there, I saw more than 1,000 of these long-range strike drones being used. And of course, this can't be done without Western assistance. But
weeks, if not months, of planning for 1,000 drones, weeks and weeks. They didn't just happen on Victory Day as a result of something. They had been planning that for weeks and weeks and weeks, if not months.
And it has to be said, to very minimal, to practically non-existent damage for at least of anything of any military value.
Have you personally seen or heard any evidence of drones in Moscow?
Personally.
Yeah, no. Explosions or some black area where it hit a building or anything? Nothing.
I'm in the south of Moscow in a forest reserve, but no, I haven't. Moscow's a big,
I know.
Out city. It's huge, right? It's some now they're saying it's some 20-some million people within what is considered the city limits. So it's huge. So in the past few days, what I've been seeing is there have been, first of all, it has to be said, Russia is firing back with very large drone and missile attacks on a regular basis, of course, as well. And these Kiev regime drone attacks are doing very little to no military damage. What I saw this week, what I've seen Tuesday, Wednesday, today, again, Thursday, is a smaller number of drones, right? A few dozen a day. But they're being sent out during the daylight hours, when they're actually easier to target with air defense, right? Every time they're launched, Russia has to shut down airports. They're launched towards Moscow, right? Because air defense becomes active, and there's a threat, and they could, of course, attack the airports. There could be developing a new pattern. Could see it this week, that the goal is not so much to do damage, but as to cause continual daylight hour disruptions to Moscow's airports.
We'll call it the Houthi strategy.
It could create. I mean, it could create a problem and some civilian blowback, right? Because people fly in and out of Moscow in very large numbers, and there's all shipping and all sorts of things other than just people every day. So Moscow has several major airports, and it could create a lot of problems and a lot of lost money for airlines, for businesses, for individuals stuck trying to get from one place to another. So it's another desperation annoyance strategy, if that's what it is. We'll see if the strategy continues for more than a few days, because I don't see that they're targeting anything in particular. It in small numbers launched during the day. I just have to wonder, is that is the target now simply disrupting Russia's airports and in Moscow? And that's not a winning strategy for a war, of course, but it can be an annoyance.
Speaking of annoyances, the last thing, I know I said that would be last, but there is one that I definitely think I have to ask you about, and that is the darn Baltics Chihuahuas. While they are a pain in the butt, oh, we're going to seize the ship, oh, you seized the ship, oh, you flew in international, the wrong airspace, whatever, it's a pain in the neck, but it's very dangerous.
Yeah,
very dangerous. Extreme. That's one of the most. Go ahead.
Yeah, this is a Chihuahua annoyance that could lead directly to NATO-Russia direct confrontation. So, now, particularly with Finland and Sweden joining NATO, there's more and more talk that the Baltic Sea is a NATO lake, right? With Russia really just having the port of St. Petersburg, right? Mainland there. Now, there is a channel of international waters straight through the Baltic Sea, but because it's so tight, several of the European countries, their exclusive economic zones extend through that area. Now, that doesn't override the rights of shipping and free transit of international travel, but the Baltics is trying to create all sorts of ridiculous excuses. And what they've been trying to work themselves up to, like a pack of hyenas trying to goad themselves to take on a lion, is to try to stop Russia's oil shipping and possibly natural gas, liquefied natural gas shipping out of St. Petersburg through the Baltic Sea. And the excuse they're using is to check for insurance, because I don't know the exact numbers, but a majority of the world's maritime insurance is out of London, right? Big maritime insurance company. And that, of course, is denied to Russia now. Well, Russia has started creating its own insurance, plus some Arabs and India and others. So they found workarounds. But this has led the West to claim that Russia's fleet is somehow a shadow fleet because they don't control the insurance for it. I don't know. I feel like I'm in an episode of Babylon 5 or something. Shadow Navy, Shadow Fleet. It's ridiculous, right? But they tried to intercept finally a Russian a merchant ship passing in international waters through the Baltic Sea in the last week, and they tried to order the captain to pull out of that international water shipping channel and pull into an Estonian port. And he said, pound sand. And then they tried to board that ship with the entire Estonian flotilla, which is 6 patrol boats, massive danger there, and helicopters. They tried to land people on the deck of the ship, and the captain just put the pedal to the metal and kept going. There was a Polish F-16 providing backup for this. Then Russia sent a Sioux out to, stop this, briefly flying through Estonian airspace to get there quickly, which they then hypocritically complained about. And that scared them off, right? They scattered. So that was prevented. But then evidently a Portuguese F-16 then arrived on the scene. So it then de-escalated at that point. But we actually saw a situation where Russia and NATO were putting multiple aircraft in the sky over this incident there, something that could have gone out of control if someone had said something stupid or some mistake had been made. And then if it's 2 or 3 days later, Russia actually seized an Estonian ship, right? Played the same game around because it briefly went into Russian waters to avoid dangerous shoals that they had previously done by agreement. But now all agreements are off, of course. So Russia says, you want to play those games? We can seize your ship. We actually have the power to do it. So anyway, but this is a dangerous situation. And someone really needs to tell the Baltics to chill. Really, I mean, like, I know they want World War III yesterday. I know they do. But some other people in Europe may still have at least a modicum of sanity left, even if it's a small amount. But this is a dangerous situation. There is going to be more provocations here and elsewhere, right? Not just this kind, but this is one type of dangerous provocation as the desperation and the panic increases in Western capitals. And it's just going to reach fever pitch over the next few months as Russia launches new and bigger offensives and the Kiev regime forces start to really crumble at different parts of the front line. You will see more such provocations and incidences and more potential danger flashpoints emerging out of this.
Mark Sleboda, tell everyone where they can find you online.
You can find me on the American oligarch Elon Musk's Twitter X at Mark Sleboda1. And you can find me on Substack and Telegram at The Real Politique with Mark Sleboda.
All right, everyone, follow me on Rockfin, follow me on Rumble, follow me on Telegram and Facebook, stuff like that. If you can afford it, whether it's Patreon, buy me a coffee, whatever the case, that'd be great. Even if you can't, just make sure you share this on all your social media platforms. Follow Mark's Substack. He does a lot of appearances and all that kind of stuff. And between his Substack and his Twitter or his X account, you can keep up with everything that Mark's doing. And of course, lastly, I now have a PO box. So if you want to send a book or a letter or anything you want, not anything, but anything safe, feel free. I don't want to get carried away here. But since, if you wanted, I've got a bunch of letters from people saying really good stuff, and I've responded to some of them. So thanks a lot. My P.O. box is there. Thanks a lot, Mark. And we look forward to talking to you again soon. All right, everybody. Don't forget, share this on all your social media platforms.